October 20th, 1944. Early morning. Leyte Island, Philippines. The decision was not made in Washington, and it was not made in a planning room. It was made on a landing craft, just offshore, with cameras already loaded and reporters waiting for a signal. General Douglas MacArthur ordered the landing craft to stop. Not at the shoreline. Not under cover. He ordered it to halt in open water, deep enough to soak his trousers, shallow enough to stage an image. The beach ahead had not been declared secure. Japanese snipers were still active in the treeline. Infantry units were still clearing resistance only meters inland. Naval commanders had not authorized a command presence ashore. None of that altered the instruction. MacArthur would go in on foot. He stepped down into the water and waited. He did not advance immediately. He allowed photographers to position themselves. He adjusted his posture. He fixed his expression. Only when the cameras were ready did he move forward, deliberately, toward the beach he had promised the American public he would return to. The order forced immediate reactions. Naval officers offshore scrambled aircraft from close air support missions to form an improvised protective screen over a single man. Ground commanders diverted troops from active clearing operations to secure a perimeter around a photo opportunity. Radios filled with confusion as units were reassigned without explanation. No one had planned for this. No one had approved it. The decision consumed time, attention, and combat resources during an active amphibious landing. MacArthur did not consult Admiral Kincaid. He did not notify the Joint Chiefs. He did not request authorization from the White House. He acted under the assumption that consequences would not follow. And in that moment, knee-deep in seawater with cameras clicking, he was correct. The photograph would be published within 48 hours. The decision had already achieved its purpose. At that moment, a different course was entirely available. By October 1944, the military situation in the Pacific had shifted decisively. Japanese naval power had been shattered. Carrier aviation dominated the sea lanes. Submarine warfare had crippled Japan's logistics. The question confronting American planners was no longer how to stop Japan, but how to end the war at the lowest strategic cost. From a strictly military perspective, the Philippines were not essential. The Joint Chiefs of Staff understood this. Admiral Ernest King and much of the Navy favored bypassing the islands altogether. The Central Pacific Drive under Admiral Chester Nimitz had proven its effectiveness. Island groups could be isolated, airfields neutralized, and garrisons left to wither without costly land campaigns. Formosa offered a closer, more direct platform for air operations against Japan itself. It shortened supply lines. It reduced exposure. It avoided committing large ground forces to jungle fighting across hundreds of islands. This approach required patience and coordination, but it conserved lives and resources. It also avoided a prolonged occupation of territory with limited operational value once Japanese sea and air power were neutralized. Even within the Southwest Pacific Theater, alternatives existed. Limited landings could secure key airfields without a full-scale return to the Philippines. Naval blockades and air interdiction could isolate Japanese forces already trapped there. The war's outcome would not hinge on MacArthur personally stepping onto Philippine soil. The opportunity was strategic restraint. American industrial output dwarfed Japan's. Time favored the Allies. Every month tightened the noose. There was no requirement for dramatic gestures. No requirement for symbolic landings. No requirement for public spectacle. But opportunity also existed in another dimension. The American public was war-weary. Casualty lists were long. Elections loomed. Public morale had become a strategic variable. Military success was no longer measured only in territory gained, but in narratives sustained. Victory had to be visible, personal, and emotionally legible to civilians thousands of miles from the front. MacArthur understood this environment with precision. He knew that strategic patience produced few headlines. He knew that bypass operations lacked visual drama. He knew that the public remembered faces and promises, not logistics and attrition curves. The opportunity he identified was not on the map. It was in perception. Returning to the Philippines allowed him to convert an operational choice into a national story. It framed the war as unfinished business rather than methodical conquest. It recast strategic necessity as moral obligation. It transformed a campaign option into a test of national honor. From a purely military standpoint, This framing was unnecessary. From a political standpoint, it was decisive. The opportunity, therefore, was twofold. The United States could have continued a calculated, naval-centric advance toward Japan, minimizing ground commitments and subordinating individual commanders to joint strategy. Or it could accept a slower, more costly path that satisfied domestic expectations and elevated a single commander into a living symbol of resolve. The first option reduced risk. The second reduced political friction. At Leyte, the photograph made clear which opportunity had already been chosen. MacArthur had prepared for this moment long before the landing craft slowed in the water. His assessment was not written in formal memoranda or circulated through staff channels. It was expressed through behavior, positioning, and the systematic shaping of expectations. By 1944, he no longer viewed his role as merely operational. He viewed it as interpretive. His task, as he understood it, was to define what victory meant before others could define it for him. He understood Washington's constraints clearly. President Roosevelt was managing a global war, a fragile alliance, and an election cycle simultaneously. The Joint Chiefs were divided between theaters, services, and personalities. Civilian control existed on paper, but it depended on public confidence to function. MacArthur's preparation rested on one assumption: that public confidence was now a weapon more powerful than formal authority. He had tested this assumption repeatedly. From Australia onward, he issued communiques that blurred the line between operational reporting and political messaging. Setbacks were reframed as necessary delays. Advances were personalized. His name appeared alongside territorial gains, as if command itself were a form of authorship. Press access was carefully managed. Favored journalists received proximity and narrative guidance. Unfavorable voices were excluded. This was not improvisation. It was discipline. MacArthur cultivated the image of inevitability. He did not argue strategy in abstract terms. He framed disagreement as moral deficiency. To oppose his route through the Southwest Pacific was to abandon allies, dishonor promises, and misunderstand the nature of American resolve. These were not military claims. They were political accusations. Internally, his staff understood the pattern. Orders were shaped with publicity in mind. Timelines were adjusted to coincide with press cycles. Personal appearances were treated as operational assets. Risk was accepted selectively, not for tactical advantage, but for symbolic yield. The warning signs were visible to anyone willing to see them. Naval commanders repeatedly raised concerns about resource diversion. Air planners questioned the prioritization of ground campaigns over carrier-based advances. Intelligence officers noted that Japanese forces in the Philippines could be neutralized without occupation. None of these objections altered MacArthur's posture. He did not counter them point by point. He ignored them. MacArthur's preparation did not involve contingency planning for failure. It involved insulation from consequence. He understood that as long as outcomes could be framed as progress, and as long as his image remained aligned with national purpose, disciplinary action would be politically costly. This understanding shaped his behavior at Leyte. The landing was not merely a return. It was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that he could unilaterally transform an active combat zone into a stage and force the institution to adapt around him. Naval aviation adjusted. Ground units repositioned. Higher command absorbed the disruption in silence. No reprimand followed. This silence was the confirmation he had been preparing for. MacArthur's foresight was not about enemy reaction. It was about institutional response. He anticipated frustration in Washington. He anticipated private anger from Roosevelt. He anticipated hostility from Admiral King. None of these concerned him, because none of them translated into action. The system absorbed his conduct because it feared the alternative. By October 1944, MacArthur had learned the boundaries of authority not by testing orders, but by testing tolerance. Each time he exceeded his remit without consequence, the boundary moved. Each accommodation taught him what could be taken next. The Leyte landing did not create this dynamic. It exposed it. What appeared to many observers as arrogance was, in fact, calculation. MacArthur had prepared for the moment when command discipline would give way to political necessity. He had prepared to operate in the space where military logic ended and public narrative began. The warning was clear, though it went unheeded. When a commander learns that visibility shields him from accountability, Preparation no longer serves strategy. It serves immunity. By the time MacArthur stepped into the water, that lesson had already been learned. The overrule did not arrive as a single order. It arrived as a series of concessions, each justified as temporary, each framed as necessary, each quietly weakening the authority it was meant to preserve. By mid-1944, the institutional balance had already shifted. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had reached a clear military conclusion. The Central Pacific offered the fastest, least costly route toward Japan. Naval power, carrier aviation, and logistics favored Admiral Nimitz's advance. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific axis required more ground troops, longer supply lines, and repeated amphibious assaults against fortified terrain. From a planning perspective, it was inefficient. Admiral Ernest King stated this without hesitation. He did not soften his language. He viewed MacArthur as insubordinate, strategically wasteful, and dangerously self-directed. King urged removal. He argued that no commander, regardless of popularity, could be allowed to operate outside unified strategy. The principle was clear. The precedent was dangerous. George Marshall understood the argument and shared much of the concern. But Marshall also understood the political terrain King ignored. He saw how deeply MacArthur's image had embedded itself in the American public. He saw the growing interest among Republican leaders. He saw the press treating MacArthur not as a subordinate, but as an alternative authority. President Roosevelt saw it most clearly of all. The overrule occurred because Roosevelt calculated risk differently than his military advisors. Removing MacArthur would not simply alter command structure. It would create a domestic political crisis during an election year, in the middle of a global war. Roosevelt was not afraid of MacArthur as a soldier. He was wary of MacArthur as a symbol. The mechanism of overrule was indirect. Rather than rejecting the Joint Chiefs outright, Roosevelt deferred. He authorized parallel advances. He allowed MacArthur to retain momentum while avoiding a public confrontation. Each decision was framed as compromise. Each accommodation was described as temporary. None were reversed. At the decisive moment, this pattern hardened into policy. The debate over the Philippines crystallized the conflict. Militarily, bypassing the islands remained viable. Politically, it was explosive. MacArthur had already framed the issue publicly. Liberation had been recast as obligation. Prisoners of war became rhetorical hostages. Any alternative plan could be portrayed as abandonment. Roosevelt understood what this meant. If he overruled MacArthur openly, he would appear to be rejecting a promise the nation had already internalized. He would validate accusations that civilian leadership was detached from sacrifice. He would hand political ammunition to opponents eager to portray weakness. So the overrule ran in the opposite direction. Roosevelt overruled his own system. At the conference that settled the issue, the Joint Chiefs presented their case. The arguments were professional, data-driven, and internally consistent. They emphasized efficiency, logistics, and casualty reduction. MacArthur did not meet them on those terms. He appealed to memory, obligation, and honor. He did not argue as a commander. He argued as a figure already standing in the public imagination. Roosevelt sided with MacArthur, not because the military case was stronger, but because the political cost of defiance was higher than the military cost of compliance. The president did not announce this reasoning. It did not need to be stated. The silence itself was the decision. Once made, the effects cascaded. Resources flowed south. Naval priorities adjusted. Air assets were reassigned. Institutional resistance softened. Opposition narrowed to private conversations and personal notes. No formal rebuke was issued. No boundaries were reasserted. The system adapted around the individual. This was the critical failure. By accommodating MacArthur's demands, civilian leadership did not merely approve a campaign. It confirmed a method. It demonstrated that strategic outcomes could be shaped through public pressure rather than internal process. It taught a senior commander that political leverage could override professional constraint. MacArthur absorbed the lesson immediately. He did not become more cautious. He became more confident. The absence of consequence validated his approach. The institution had shown its limits. Authority existed, but it hesitated. Discipline existed, but it bent. The Leyte landing was the visible result of this overrule, not its cause. By the time MacArthur stepped into the water, the decision had already been made elsewhere. The system had chosen accommodation over confrontation. It had chosen continuity over correction. It had accepted that one commander would operate with unusual latitude because removing him had become politically unmanageable. This was not a failure of information. It was not a misunderstanding of strategy. It was a failure of enforcement. Civilian control had not collapsed. It had been negotiated away, increment by incremental concession, until it no longer constrained the man it was meant to govern. The overrule was complete before the cameras arrived. And once complete, it could not be quietly undone. What followed unfolded exactly along the lines the decision had set. The Leyte landing became a national spectacle. Newspapers printed the image of MacArthur wading ashore as if it were the decisive act of the Pacific War. The complexity of the operation disappeared behind a single frame. The diverted aircraft, the disrupted command flow, the exposed troops clearing ground without air cover for critical minutes. None of that entered the public record. The story was already written, and it required no revision. Operationally, the consequences accumulated quietly. The return to the Philippines locked the Southwest Pacific into a resource-intensive campaign that could not be shortened once begun. Every additional landing required shipping, air cover, engineers, and ground forces that could not be reassigned elsewhere. The Navy absorbed these demands while continuing the Central Pacific Drive, stretching logistics across two converging offensives rather than concentrating effort. This was manageable, but it was not optimal. Japanese forces in the Philippines did not collapse as a coherent formation. They fragmented, dispersed, and entrenched. The campaign became one of attrition rather than maneuver. Each island cleared was tactically successful and strategically redundant. The war moved forward, but not faster. Within the command structure, the effects were more corrosive. MacArthur's conduct at Leyte did not produce reprimand or correction. It produced accommodation. Staff officers adjusted expectations. Naval commanders planned around his presence rather than asserting authority over it. Ground units learned that public optics could override tactical priority. The chain of command remained intact on paper, but in practice it bent to avoid friction. This shift altered behavior. MacArthur's public statements grew more declarative. His communiques increasingly implied inevitability rather than progress. He did not describe campaigns as joint efforts. He described them as fulfillments of promise. Strategic language gave way to moral framing. Opposition within the system receded further into private correspondence. The Joint Chiefs took note, but they did not intervene. They had already learned the cost of confrontation. Admiral King's hostility hardened into resignation. Marshall focused on containment rather than correction. The objective became finishing the war without provoking a political rupture that could fracture civilian confidence. The battlefield absorbed the consequences of this restraint. Operations in the Philippines extended longer than projected. Casualties mounted steadily. Japanese resistance persisted in areas that could have been isolated rather than assaulted. None of these outcomes reversed the war's trajectory, but they added weight to it. The cost was cumulative rather than catastrophic, which made it easier to accept and harder to challenge. Meanwhile, the precedent established at Leyte continued to operate. MacArthur increasingly treated his theater as autonomous. He negotiated with Washington through public expectation rather than staff process. Requests arrived framed as necessities rather than proposals. Strategic disagreement became politically sensitive by default. The system no longer asked whether an action was appropriate. It asked whether opposing it was worth the reaction. This dynamic reached its most visible consequence after the war itself. When Japan surrendered, MacArthur emerged not only as a victorious commander, but as a governing authority. He assumed control of the occupation with minimal oversight. The habits formed during the war persisted into peace. Decisions were announced rather than coordinated. Policies were issued as proclamations. Washington monitored, advised, and hesitated. The cost of earlier accommodation became structural. MacArthur had learned that institutional limits were elastic. He had learned that popularity delayed discipline. He had learned that civilian leaders weighed political risk more heavily than procedural breach. These lessons did not fade with the end of hostilities. They hardened. When conflict resumed in Korea, the same pattern reappeared. MacArthur issued public statements that diverged from official policy. He communicated with foreign leaders without authorization. He framed strategic disagreement as moral failure. Each act echoed Leyte, not in form, but in logic. Visibility replaced obedience. Narrative replaced hierarchy. This time, the consequences were no longer absorbed quietly. The Truman administration inherited the accumulated weight of Roosevelt's earlier decisions. The political environment had changed, but the commander had not. MacArthur behaved as if the same rules still applied. He assumed that public support would once again deter correction. For a time, it nearly did. The costs were immediate. Civilian control appeared compromised. Allied policy coherence weakened. Military advice competed with public declarations. The structure held, but it strained visibly. Unlike Leyte, the consequences could no longer be confined to internal frustration or extended timelines. They became constitutional. When the decision finally came to remove MacArthur, it arrived not as a reaction to a single act, but as a delayed response to a pattern that had been tolerated too long. The confrontation Roosevelt had avoided was deferred, not eliminated. Truman paid the political price that had been postponed. Leyte, in retrospect, marked the point of no return. It was not the most dangerous thing MacArthur ever did. It was the most revealing. It demonstrated that the system would absorb risk to avoid conflict. It showed that civilian authority could be maintained in appearance while yielding in practice. It taught a commander that boundaries were negotiable if public sentiment could be mobilized. The battlefield consequences were real but manageable. The institutional consequences were enduring. Once a military system accepts that a commander's image can outweigh discipline, it does not return easily to equilibrium. Each exception requires another. Each accommodation narrows the space for correction. The cost accumulates invisibly until it demands payment in full. That payment did not come at Leyte. It came later, under different circumstances, with fewer options and higher stakes. But the invoice was issued the moment the landing craft stopped in the water, and no one countermanded the order. The post-war record closed the gap between perception and documentation. Once the fighting ended, the justification for accommodation disappeared, and the paper trail remained. Memoirs, internal correspondence, and declassified memoranda revealed how narrowly civilian authority had been preserved during the war, and how deliberately it had been compromised in practice. Franklin Roosevelt left no public reckoning. He died in April 1945, having never formally disciplined Douglas MacArthur. Privately, his irritation was well documented. He complained to aides. He vented to Admiral William Leahy. He acknowledged that MacArthur was difficult, egocentric, and politically dangerous. What he never did was convert frustration into action. The reason appears consistently in the record. Roosevelt believed that removing MacArthur would fracture domestic unity at a moment when unity itself was a strategic asset. He feared a public backlash more than a command breakdown. In his calculus, political stability outweighed procedural enforcement. That calculation was not theoretical. It governed years of decisions. George Marshall's post-war statements are restrained but revealing. He acknowledged that MacArthur had been impossible, yet insisted that containment was preferable to confrontation. The phrase he used repeatedly was necessity. MacArthur, in Marshall's view, was not manageable through normal command channels, but removing him was judged too disruptive to attempt. Admiral King's record is less diplomatic. His wartime memoranda and later recollections make clear that he considered MacArthur's behavior corrosive and his strategic preferences inefficient. He argued that tolerance of insubordination weakened the institution. His advice was ignored. The record shows that he understood precisely what precedent was being set and objected to it in real time. MacArthur's own post-war writings tell a different story. In his memoirs, he framed his actions as inevitable expressions of leadership. He did not acknowledge constraint. He did not describe negotiation. He portrayed his authority as self-evident and his judgment as decisive. Civilian oversight appears in his narrative only as interference or misunderstanding. The absence of reprimand during the war reinforced this self-conception. The occupation of Japan provided further evidence. MacArthur operated with extraordinary autonomy. Washington issued guidance. MacArthur interpreted it. Policies were implemented through his headquarters with minimal modification. When disagreements arose, they were resolved through delay rather than enforcement. The system continued to avoid direct confrontation. This pattern ended only when circumstances changed. Harry Truman did not inherit Roosevelt's political environment. The war was over. Elections were not imminent. The public mood had shifted. Most importantly, the stakes of inaction had risen. In Korea, MacArthur's public defiance directly challenged stated policy. The record shows that Truman was acutely aware of the precedent he was confronting. Truman's decision to relieve MacArthur in April 1951 reads, in hindsight, as a correction deferred too long. Congressional hearings that followed exposed the accumulated consequences of years of tolerance. Senators questioned not only MacArthur's conduct, but the system that had enabled it. Civilian control had survived, but only after being visibly tested. The post-war consensus that emerged was quiet but firm. MacArthur had been effective but uncontainable. Roosevelt had been pragmatic but indulgent. The system had functioned, but at the cost of clarity. No formal doctrine changed as a result, but institutional memory hardened. Future commanders would be managed differently. Popularity would be monitored. Public engagement would be constrained. Leyte appeared in the record not as an isolated incident, but as an early indicator. It was cited less for what happened tactically than for what it revealed institutionally. It showed how far a commander could go when the political cost of stopping him seemed too high. It showed how civilian authority could erode without formally surrendering. The post-war record did not accuse. It documented. And in that documentation, the pattern became undeniable. The case closes with a simple conclusion. Douglas MacArthur was not untouchable because he was indispensable. He was untouchable because removing him carried a political cost civilian leadership chose not to pay. His authority did not expand through victory alone. It expanded through tolerance. The decision to accommodate him was not irrational. It was calculated. It preserved domestic unity. It avoided confrontation. It kept a popular symbol aligned with national effort during a global war. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, it distorted command discipline. By allowing a commander to operate beyond normal constraint, the system taught him that visibility could substitute for obedience. It taught institutions to adapt around behavior rather than correct it. It preserved civilian control in form while weakening it in practice. Leyte did not win the war. It did not lose it either. What it did was reveal the price of deferring enforcement. The battlefield absorbed the immediate cost. The institution absorbed the precedent. Roosevelt chose stability over correction. Truman later chose correction over stability. Both decisions carried consequences. One postponed them. The other paid them publicly. MacArthur's career did not end in defeat. It ended in removal. Not because his judgment failed tactically, but because the system could no longer afford to absorb his defiance. The line that had been blurred during war had to be redrawn in peace. In the act of redrawing, it was inevitably disruptive. This was not a story about ego alone. It was a story about structure under pressure, about how systems behave when symbols become politically expensive to challenge, about how authority erodes not through collapse, but through accommodation. The record is closed. If you want more investigations into the decisions made far from the front lines, subscribe to the channel and leave your perspective in the comments.